Hi, my name is Judith Weiner. I'm here as OLLI's program manager, and we're going to get started. And I have just a few short announcements. As we begin, with gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that those of us in the Berkshires are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I have just a few short announcements, and then we'll get started. To learn more about programming at OLLI at BCC, you can check out our website at berkshireolli.org, and I've just put that in the chat for you. And there are a number of upcoming workshops, lectures, and new programs that are being held and posted regularly, so be sure to check out our website for some of those. Would like to highlight just a couple of upcoming lectures from our Distinguished Speakers Lecture Series, including on August 19th on Zoom, Engineering Trustworthiness, Moving from Broken to Whole with Dr. Julia Waterchill. On September 4th, also on Zoom, Stan Brown on Robert Caro's work, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. And finally, on Thursday, September 25 at 7 p.m. on Zoom, Oren Cass will come and is talking to us on American politics. And now I'm going to turn it over to John Dixon, who will introduce our speaker, James Brooke.
Thank you, Judith, and welcome everybody. And thank you, Jim, for agreeing to do this once again. I think you've done it every quarter since February of 2022, and it never fails that there's always something new and usually something happening on the day you do this. So you're not always just going back through your old notes, you're keeping up. Those of you who know Jim know he's a Berkshire native. He grew up in Lenox. After graduating from Yale, he entered the world of journalism with an urge to be a foreign correspondent. For 24 years, he served as a foreign correspondent with the New York Times in Brazil, Canada, West Africa, Tokyo, and Seoul. He was a Bloomberg correspondent in Russia. He signed on as correspondent for the Voice of America for Russia. And after 8 years in Russia, he moved to Ukraine. For 6 years in Kyiv, he founded and edited internet-based newsletter on Ukraine's business and investment opportunities. He relocated back home to Lenox just a few months before the outbreak of war. Now you can see his columns, many of which touch on Russia and Ukraine, in the pages of the New York Sun. Jim's extended personal experiences in both Moscow and Kyiv have given him and us, through him, a unique vantage point to look at the current situation. I have found Jim's writing and these talks always provides information that I don't find anywhere else. So I'm very pleased, Jim, that you're able to do this once again for us. So please, Jim is going to talk for a brief time. If you have comments or questions, put them in chat. And at some point when he finishes, I'll try to go through the chat and organize and pose questions and comments to him. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John, and hello, OLLI audience. It's great to be back again. These talks really help me kind of put my thoughts together and synthesize. I'm talking to you this evening on a very sort of crucial moment. A few hours ago, President Trump announced that he will be meeting with President Putin as early as next week, and that is to be followed by a trilateral three-way meeting, Trump, Putin, Zelensky. So things are moving fairly fast. Today, the tariffs on India were raised to 50%, and President Trump has threatened to put them on China because they are subsidizing the war in Ukraine by buying Russian oil. Each country, Russia and China, buy about 2 million barrels a day, which covers a good chunk of the defense budget of Russia. I thought, to make things sort of digestible, I divided up into what I call the 4 Ds: demographics, drones, development, and dictatorship. I thought I'd start with demographics, and this may give insight into why Putin may want to broker a deal with President Trump in coming weeks. In the 3.5-year war, Russia has lost, according to acceptable numbers, over 1 million dead and wounded. In the last 6 months, it's been 267,000 or 38,000 a month. That means that in the first 7 months of this year, Russia has lost about 4 times the dead and wounded that Soviet Union lost during their decade in Afghanistan. So in 7 months, Russia's lost 4 times the dead and wounded as the Soviets lost in a decade in Afghanistan. And once again, the Soviet Union had twice the population of Russia. So we're talking about apples and oranges here. And then this year, and obviously the Russians don't publicize this, but the war is shaping up as the bloodiest year of the 3.5-year war. We may see, if things go at current rates, we could see 500,000 Russian casualties, dead and wounded. Just for comparison, the US lost 1.1 million dead and wounded during World War II. So this is not a minor kind of regional war. This is a biggie, and this is sort of the story of our time. What you're seeing in Russia is, as usual, they're obfuscating. A very interesting Rosstat, which is the government statistics agency, last month quietly stopped publishing its monthly demographic data. So we don't know what is happening with the population of Russia. However, last month, Russia's labor minister told Putin that Russia will be short of 11 million workers within 5 years. And the war is obviously contributing to this. And in a first step, Russia plans to import 1 million Indian workers over the next year to make up for labor shortages. We see little clues. About 90 men's jails have been closed since the war started. This is due to very aggressive recruiting of prisoners to send them to the battlefront. So men's jails are closing. The life expectancy of a Russian soldier is measured in weeks rather than months on the front line. Here's a number to look forward to, a date to look forward to. On January 10, Moscow will have been fighting in Ukraine as long as the Soviet Union fought in World War II, which is 3 years and 10 months. Now, during that time, during World War II, the Red Army traveled 1,200 miles and conquered everything in its path. By contrast, in 3 years and 5 months, Russia really only controls the southeast fringe of Ukraine, about 19%. The last year and a half, Russia's taken 5,000 square miles of Ukraine. Now, that may sound like a lot, but it's really only 2% of Ukraine, which happens to be 50% bigger than California. So when you read that Russia's winning the land more or Russia's advancing, it's advancing at a snail's pace. And it will take 5 years at this rate for Putin to take full control of the 4 regions of Ukraine that he formally annexed 3 years ago. So, and we're in the midst of the summer offensive, but if you look at your calendar, the summer is kind of 2/3 of the way over. Today's August 6th. The summer theoretically is over in a month. And then in Ukraine, you get the autumn rains starting at the end of next month. So this famous summer offensive hasn't really produced much. The centerpiece is an attack, really almost a siege on the city of Pokrovsk, which the Russians love because it used to be called Krasnoarmeysk, which means Red Army City. In this attack, there are apparently 110,000 Russian soldiers facing 11,000 Ukrainian soldiers, with a ratio of 10-1. The offensive started July 18, 2024. This offensive has been going on now for, let's just say, 1 year. they have not made a lot of progress. So that was the summer offensive of 2024, and they're still at it trying to take Pokrovsk. The Russian army has become a walking army or a hiking army. In the 3.5 years of war, they've lost 11,000 tanks, 23,000 armored personnel carriers, and about 57,000 jeeps and trucks. They hike, they use motorcycles, even bicycles. Um, Now, we know our history. The Red Army walked 1,200 miles from Moscow to Berlin, but um, the Russian army is not walking into Pokrovsk, as I just pointed out. Which leads us to the second D, which are drones. What you're watching, you are the witnesses to the world's first major drone war. You may recall 18 months ago, I was talking and people were wailing the Ukrainians are running short of artillery shells. You don't hear that anymore because it's become a drone war. At least 2/3 of the casualties are by drones. What you're seeing is turning conventional war strategy on its head. It's basically a drone first strategy on the front line. The front line stretches for 600 miles. Um, Sometimes the Ukrainians are so short of men and women that there are only 6 soldiers per half mile. Now, in a half mile, you should have a full battalion, which is several hundred soldiers. That's not there. So you're having this weird, unprecedented situation where the Ukrainians are kind of hunkered down, and Ukrainian infantrymen have become spotters. They see a Russian soldier, they see 3 Russian soldiers scurrying across the front line. They are under orders not to shoot them. They're under orders to call in the drone strike. If they shoot them, they reveal their placement, their firing station. So oddly, soldiers are turning into spotters. Um, Now, the skies above the front lines, and they call it the kill zone, about 5 miles on either side. And they're matched hand to hand, Russian and Ukrainian drones. The skies above the front line are filled with kamikaze drones, surveillance drones, bomber drones, heat-seeking drones, and they do just that at night. They try to see a man walking across the front line. Land drones, which essentially are like ATVs that'll move across very difficult terrain. They're mother drones that go in and then let off little drones. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has had tremendous success with nautical drones, and hopefully the US Navy has taken note. You see a lot of drone versus drone, interceptor drones. I saw a picture of a Russian drone that had a bird silhouette painted on top of the drone, trying to pass itself off as a bird, because the drone versus drone is a big deal. I mean, there's one Ukrainian unit that actually used their own drones, and in 1 month shot down 268 Russian drones. As I mentioned, though, the land drones are these on autopilot. Well, they're actually remote control piloted machines. They've actually extricated a wounded soldier or two. The cargo drones are dropping medicine, food, and ammunition. There's one drone that actually dropped an electric bicycle to help a wounded soldier get out of a very tight space. Ukrainian drones have guided Russian soldiers through a minefield to surrender. That happens fairly often. We're seeing, this is, as I said, a drone war. In our time in 2025, for foot soldiers, drones are truly infernal machines. And it's the same word in Russian, same word in Ukrainian, drone. And they are obsessed with them. The drones can, and I'm looking at an open window now, drones can fly in open windows. They can fly around bridge pylons to kill men standing behind cement. They can slip underneath trucks or jeeps. Loitering drones will either hover in the air or sit on the road or by the road, and they'll be active as long as their batteries are good for us. So they could be sitting there on the shoulder of the road, just looking like a nondescript piece of metal. A Jeep or truck will go by and they'll blow up. Just on Sunday, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, Ukrainian drones flew across the Black Sea to the Crimean airbase Sakhi, which has been hit several times. There, the Russians have built reinforced concrete bunkers. The drones somehow got into the concrete bunkers and destroyed or damaged 5 Sukhoi fighter bombers, which is about $150 million worth of equipment. In this drone versus drone environment, a Russian soldier either they found his body or he surrendered. He was wearing a modified smartwatch, which was giving him in real time data from drone detectors to warn him of incoming drones. On both sides, they are building steel netting over key stretches of road to stop drones coming in and hitting cargo trucks. The latest thing, and well, in this case, is already 4 months old. There are these fiber optic drones, which you can't jam because they're connected to the operator by a filament about the size of human hair that can go for 10 miles and it spools out like a fishing rod. And they found these networks of wires. And actually, there's a picture of a Russian soldier cutting one with a pair of scissors. This is what we're living in. And each side, Russia and Ukraine, are building about 4 million drones this year. It's a big deal. It's a core deal. And this is why Ukrainian drone operators are training British Army drone operators. And this is why President Trump is talking to Zelensky about a deal that might involve the US Army or the Pentagon buying 10 to $30 billion worth of Ukrainian drones. Why invent the wheel? Go to the best. And the best drones and drone operators that are available to the West are on the Ukrainian side. The third D is development, another word for economy. The state of Russia's economy may explain why President Putin is at least playing at talking with President Trump. In the course of the war, Russia has burned up about 2/3 of its sovereign wealth fund, which is sort of its pillow. These are oil and gas export earnings that they have put aside for the rainy day, and this is a rainy day. Well, they've drawn through about 2/3 of that, and definitely this time next year, probably early next spring, they're really going to be short of money. Ukraine, since the beginning of this year, has hit 23 different oil refineries in Western Russia. Drones themselves don't carry the punch that like a missile would carry, but you really get leverage by hitting a refinery, and you can see by these videos of spectacular fires. This adds up. This week, Russia is imposing a 2-month ban on the exports of gasoline. Yesterday, Bloomberg reported that Russian oil earnings are down by 1/3 year over year. It's starting to squeeze. And President Trump is planning or threatening more sanctions on what's called the shadow oil fleet. These are sort of outlaw ships that don't use Western insurance, don't follow Western safety standards, and are carrying Russian oil out of the Black Sea, out of the Baltic Sea, out of the Arctic, to India, China, and other countries. By sanctioning these ships, Reuters has shown that their volume really radically drops. We're talking about a universe of maybe 600-700 ships. We've been a little bit asleep at the wheel. We're unaware of this going on. I'll tell you, when one of these things crashes into the English Channel, we will be very aware that these ships have very poor safety standards and no Western insurance. So it's a ticking time bomb for one of these ships to run aground somewhere. Russia has been very successful in beating sanctions so far, relatively successful. It's gotten to the point that a top Moscow university is offering a new master's degree, sanctions evasion. That would be a great diploma to have on your wall. Moscow State University MBA sanctions evasion. If things fall apart in Russia, you could probably move to North Korea. But in the real world, in the corporate world, things are not going well. The big news was 2 weeks ago, Russia's central bank finally lowered its prime interest rate. Now, here in the US, Trump's been browbeating the head of the Fed to lower our interest rate. In Russia, it was lowered to 18%. It was at 20%, now it's at 18%. There are going to be many corporate bankruptcies by the end of this year. People just can't pay their bills. And once again, in the real world of private investment, corporate investment, the Western divestment campaign has succeeded in persuading 1,000 American and European companies to divest from Russia. I was the Bloomberg bureau chief at one point in Moscow, and everyone was coming to Moscow. Everyone wanted to be there. Everyone wanted to produce. Everyone wanted to sell to this oil-rich market. But 1,000 of these companies have pulled up stakes, and often selling out for pennies on the dollar. Now, for Putin, there's a short-term plus. He's sold these companies to his buddies, the sons and daughters of his cohorts. He's created a new elite. And there was a bit of a thaw last May when the head of the Russian Investment Fund was in Washington and telling Americans, come on back to Russia. He came home and Putin faced a room full of this new elite, and they were quite concerned, starting with the Russian who now owns McDonald's. Like, I know I don't want to sell it back to McDonald's. And to diffuse the tension, Putin cited an old joke, old saying really, which is only cowards pay their debts. Just mull that one over. Only cowards pay their debts. Would you like to invest in a country where that's a slogan? I don't think so. It's a strange cornerstone for a market economy. So I'll move on to our fourth D, which is dictator. Putin likes being a wartime president. He has, it was very funny. I got an email from the former executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, who's commenting about a story I did about 2 months ago on a Soviet era theater called Taganka. And it was a friend of mine, Bernie Gortzman, who then was Moscow bureau chief, who had covered Eugene McCarthy going to the Taganka Theater, probably around 1970, and yucking it up with the liberal theater director. And I was commenting with Bill Keller, former executive editor of the New York Times, that, it's odd to think that late Brezhnev was a bit more liberal than contemporary Putin. It's an arguable point, but things were a little more open then. The free internet in Russia is now dead. Last week, Putin signed a law imposing fines of $6,000 for anyone searching for extremist materials or promoting VPNs, which is this workaround that allows you to, quote, anonymously surf the net. The Russian Justice Ministry's list of extremist materials stretches for more than 500 pages. Russian authorities block access to 500,000 websites. I mean, this is really ferocious, internet era digital censorship that the communists would have been very jealous of. The Here's an example. 2 weeks ago, a father of 3 small children was sentenced to 3 years in jail for donating $15 to Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, a donation he gave 4 years ago in 2021. He was charged with financing extremist activity. The story there is not that this poor guy is now sitting in jail for 3 years. The story is that they made this very public as a warning to the populace at large. Don't look around on the internet. And there's plenty of corruption inside Russia. They actually just discovered the mayor of Vladivostok owns 821 properties. I mean, corruption is their big thing. So you're dumbing down the Russian populace very quickly and really restricting. I mean, I one time was the Voice America bureau chief in Russia. That is, if it still exists, because Trump unfortunately closed most of it, along with Radio Free Europe. But BBC in Russia and Russian, that is considered extremist. What's left of VOA and Radio Free Europe, also extremist. So if you look at all the exile Russian media that's in Latvia or Amsterdam is considered extremist. And this affects Russian public opinion. When I lived in Russia, one Russian told me that Russians will believe what they're told to believe. And I thought that was a pretty snotty comment, but I over the years, it has not dropped out of my head, and I think it's probably very, very relevant. I'll finish up. I'm basically saying I think the tragedy of the war is it really is due to one man and his obsessions. When I lived in Russia and I left Russia, I was there like I think 2006 to 2014, 8 years. There was a nationalist, but it was a fringe. I mean, they'd have their rallies on special days, like the Tsar's birthday or something. And you get on a subway and you go all the way out to the very end of the subway. They weren't letting them demonstrate around, the Bolshoi or anywhere in the Kremlin, anywhere in the center of town. And there were these guys dressed up in Tsarist uniforms, sort of waving flags of the Tsarist Navy and sort of odd flags. But these ultra-nationalists were a fringe and maybe 5, at best 20%. And they didn't do too well, the polls either. Putin has adopted this, and to make up for the fact that 80% of the population really isn't interested in conquering Ukraine, he's imposed this incredible censorship and he's come out of the closet as a unreconstructed imperialist at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which only 10 years ago, 5 years ago, was there to attract foreign investors and show them how wonderful Russia is. He told in a media session, he said, the Russian and Ukrainian people are one people. So all of Ukraine is ours. Wherever a Russian soldier's foot steps, that's ours. So this is the guy who has started this war and has kept it going. And let's see how far things go with the Trump orchestrated, at least a ceasefire. But he likes the censorship, he likes the control, and the war has been good to him politically. So I'm going to open up to questions. I hope that was interesting to everybody. And John, let her rip.
Well, I was going to ask you to do a little bit more on the last point you talked about and add a fifth D, which is diplomacy. Um, what I
Yeah,
read something
well,
this.
yeah, and by the way, Putin turns 73 in October, and yeah, mark your calendars, October 7th. I think he still has it in him to invade a few more countries. The Baltics and the Poles are quite alarmed. I didn't mention the Europeans who are somewhat engaged in diplomacy. They're really more engaged in rearming. And the last week, Poland signed a contract to buy about 300 tanks from South Korea. When those tanks are delivered, Poland will have more tanks than Germany, Britain, France, and Italy added up together. So outside of Ukraine, the largest army in Europe will be Polish. The largest NATO army in Europe will be Polish. Um, yeah, diplomacy, I mean, you just learn to severely discount whatever comes out of a Russian official's mouth. Um, whether Putin has gotten to the stage where he really there was some talk about an air ceasefire, an air truce. Putin often suggests truces for areas where he's losing. I think in the spring it was like, why do we have a truce in the Black Sea? Well, he's lost control of the Black Sea. It's kind of done. He is not losing the air war, but he's losing a lot. I mean, as I said, 23 refineries have been hit. So some Kremlin folk sort of leaked to Bloomberg 24 hours ago that maybe an air truce would be in the making. Putin still believes he's winning the land war, partly because his people tell him that. He's not seeing the numbers that I just told you, that he's wasted 250,000 lives to conquer, an extra 1% of Ukraine. Um, whether his back is financially up against the wall, I'm not sure. Trump, on the other hand, is actually putting his money where his mouth is. People said he wouldn't put these tariffs on India for buying Russian oil, and he's done that. And today he's intimating he'll do the same with China and other countries. And that really is the lifeblood of Russia. And if they can't sell their oil, they're going to run out of money. And so potentially Putin is looking for a face-saving way out. He's been offered off ramps, exit ramps in the past. This spring, Trump offered him basically recognition of the Soviet occupation, of the Russian occupation of Crimea. The occupation frees the lines where they are, and Russia will control that, and no NATO for Ukraine. And he could have gussied that up and sold it to his people as a victory, but he kept charging ahead, and 100,000 Russian casualties later, he's still fighting the fight. So let's see what comes in coming days.
Okay. We have a lot of questions on different aspects of it and some specific questions, but let's return to Putin and his political. Is he immune to, or the Russians not giving him, putting pressure on him because of the casualties or because of the economy, or he's just totally immune from that?
Well, I think, I mean, this thing that he has apparently agreed to do a trilateral may indicate that he is seeing that things are not going well in the economy. Um, I think Lenin once said that nothing happens for a century, that everything happens in 1 week. So things could fall fast if they fall. On the other hand, Adolf Hitler stayed in his bunker until the Red Army was 500 yards away. I'm not saying it's going to come down to the bunker, but a lot of smart people in the Kremlin and in Washington have watched Putin ruin his country, ruin relations with the West, ruin relations with investors, and really cut ruin Russia's influence in the region. There's a little footnote, which is that according to today's Washington Post, on Friday, the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan will meet in Washington and sign a peace deal, which may include allowing a U.S. company to run this transit corridor on the southern border of Armenia, northern border of Iran. Let's see what happens, but this is Moscow's role. Moscow is supposed to be the kingmaker, and it has been the kingmaker for 200 years in Armenia since they took it away from the Persians, and maybe 80 years for Azerbaijan. So it's well, 100 years for Azerbaijan. So Russia is kind of losing influence right and left, and the Russian people are kind of keeping their heads down. John, you sent me an email asking about Aeroflot, but a lot of Russian vacations were ruined because there was a 1-year mole operation by cyber hackers from Ukraine that got inside Aeroflot, destroyed 7,000 servers, got hold of all the emails, got hold of the data of the passengers and the crew and the pilots, and really screwed up Aeroflot. And tens of thousands of Russians had their summer vacation plans destroyed by this. It just happened last week. I think I keep getting reports from people in Russia telling me that the air travel is all screwed up this summer. And we all know Russia has a winter which kind of goes from November 1 through March 1 minimum. They like their summer vacations, and the Russian middle class is being deprived of summer vacation. And last year, Aeroflot flew about a third of the country. They flew 55 million people. That's the entire middle class of Russia flying around on Aeroflot. And this is not popular.
We've seen Putin use some nuclear gamesmanship, and Medvedev also used it last week when Trump said he would be sanctioning third parties about the purchase of oil. And he said he was moving nuclear submarines closer to the Mediterranean. How do you see it? I haven't heard Putin say he's going to use tactical nuclear weapons as he has in the past.
Yeah. Medvedev is the former president. He was sort of the stand-in when Putin wanted to pull back for a few years. And then he was prime minister, and then Putin kind of pushed him aside and made him deputy chair of some National Security Council. The joke about Medvedev was that he was tweeting while drinking. And so he's been known over the last couple of years for very sort of scurrilous, inflammatory tweets. And he did too a few days ago. And he referred to the dead hand, which is a Soviet term for if the nomenclatura is taking out, the missiles will go off because there's just an automatic system. And that's kind of scary talk, frankly. And I think Putin used Medvedev to say kind of kooky but deniable things. Trump took it seriously and said that Medvedev should watch his mouth, basically, and he choose his words more carefully or something. And then Trump said that he moved 2 nuclear submarines into better positions. Now, nuclear submarines could be nuclear powered or a nuclear submarine with nuclear missiles on it. Better position, I mean, if we want to, we can hit anywhere from anywhere. The submarines don't have to be in the Arctic or the Baltic or the Black Sea. They can't get into the Black Sea. So I think that was a little bit of shadow boxing. Everyone's aware that both countries have about 6,000 nuclear bombs and could end the planet if they wanted to. I don't see that happening. And I think the fact that Trump and Putin are going to meet, which the Trump people are kind of billing as a victory. I mean, no, I mean, Putin's been wanting to meet Trump all along. It's more a Putin victory that Trump has agreed to see him after 6 months of the presidency. A Trump, Zelensky, Putin trilateral, that would be a big plus potentially.
We have a lot of questions, Jim, on the industrial military complex in both countries. I mean, Russia has an incredible industrial capacity, as does Ukraine. Are they churning out more than drones? We
Yeah,
keep
yeah, they
seeing that.
are. They're
What
they're
I see
churn-
on, oh, go
the
ahead.
Russians are churning out advanced tanks. I think they've tripled their production of their most advanced tank in the last 3 years. But these tanks are not showing up on the battlefield. And this unnerves people like the Poles and, of course, the Balts. So where are these tanks going after they come out of Nizhny Tagil, Mash, Zagon Vod, whatever it's called? And they are rebuilding some of their APCs. I mean, Ukraine has done everyone a big service. Russia has burned through most of their Cold War stockpiles of metal, of hardware. And this is confirmed by satellite photos of the patios where you'd have maybe 483 armored personnel carriers, and now you have 20 or something. And so that stuff has been used. But the defense industries are working triple shifts and cranking out what they can. The Russians have bought a huge amount of artillery shells and howitzers from the North Koreans, um, which is not good because the North Koreans have improved their accuracy with these cannons they make. The Ukrainians, they have a very good, they've improved upon it a lot, their armaments industry. One fear was that if Russia actually takes Ukraine, which it won't, I don't think it will happen, you'd be marrying or recreating the Soviet military industrial complex. You'd be adding Ukraine to Russia, and there would, Europe be sitting with their 900 tanks, and that's why the Poles are investing 5% of their GDP into defense. Ukrainians during the Cold War built the ICBMs that were aimed at Times Square and Washington. They have very good rocketry and not just, well, cruise missiles, but ICBMs. And they are developing missiles that could go 1,000 miles into Russia with a fair degree of accuracy. So they were quite good in that field. And Ukrainians, if you give them a drink or two, will tell them that there would have been no Soviet space program without Ukrainian brains, which is probably true.
Um, s- so can you talk a little bit, because we have a number of questions about Ukraine, what's going on in Ukraine? The images we see at night is just of devastation. Every night, a different apartment buildings being hit, not by drones necessarily, but by missiles that have somehow evaded the shield, and also a little bit about the corruption law that
Yeah,
was
no,
protest there.
good, two good points. Ukraine's strategy is to take out the military industrial complex of Russia as best they can. And once again, drones that can fly 600 miles don't really pack a big punch, but they've hit, as I said, 23 refineries, a lot of rail, in the last few weeks, a lot of oil depots, rail yards, um, factories that build like guidance systems for missiles, instrument systems. That's their strategy. The Russian strategy is to basically do what the Germans did in 1944-45 in London, which is the Blitz, which is firing supersonic V2 rockets to set a city. And so the Russian rockets and drones are hitting apartment buildings. And I know, I mean, the playground where my son used to play got hit. The children's hospital, the largest children's state hospital in the country, was blown up about a year ago. They're just sort of firing missiles and drones at the cities, and lots of them. I mean, there are times there's 700 drones and missiles that have to be intercepted, and they do a pretty good job with these Iranian-designed Shaheds, taking down maybe 85%, but they do get through, and the missiles are a lot harder to take down, and that's why they want more Patriots from the US. So the Russian strategy is to break the morale of the civilian population. It didn't work in London during the Blitz, and I don't think it's working. I'm not there, but everything I hear is it's not working in Ukraine. People are just moving around or moving to their mother's dacha, that sort of thing. The corruption is a problem. I don't know why Zelensky passed these two bills that were going to assert government control over the anti-corruption agencies. What is interesting is the huge outpouring of protest from one end of the country to the other. And it's very interesting to look at the signs. They're all written in Ukrainian. They're not written in English to impress the World Bank. They are young people who see themselves as Europeans, who want to join the wider Western world. And as I said, they came out from Kyiv to Lviv, from east to west, and basically so impressed the government that the government did a U-turn. And also the EU was saying, you know, if you put these anti-corruption agencies under your thumb, you're not joining the EU. So there was that element too. The anti-corruption agencies were unshackled, and about a week later, they indicted a sitting congressman for manipulating drone procurement. And corruption is a problem. The way things are going here, I don't know if we should be casting stones, but the Ukrainians post-war want to construct a society of laws and honest judges, and that's the goal, and that's why they want to be part of the EU. Major reason there.
And how is Ukraine surviving now? Is there an economy? They were the breadbasket of that area? Are they
Yeah, you know, one reason why Putin wants to have a truce in the Black Sea is because he lost control. He was trying to blockade the ports, the big grain ports. The grain harvest, I'm told, is going to be bigger this year than last. It's near normal levels, even though they've lost some areas. The shipments they have a corridor that's being protected by the Ukrainians. It kind of hugs the Black Sea coast until they get to the Strait of the Bosphorus, the Turkish Strait. So the grains are getting out, some getting out by train. Obviously, a lot of foreign aid is pouring in. Just going back to the military complex, there are a lot of, you know, the Norwegians and the Germans are doing JVs inside Ukraine to build arms inside Ukraine. And that's providing employment. And once again, the European strategy, they're not doing it to be nice. They're doing it because they want to stop the Russian bear in eastern Ukraine and not in eastern Poland. Not try to get the Russians out of the Baltics, which they could take over in 10 days. They want to preemptively stop the Russians in eastern Ukraine, and hence they are spending big dollars, euros, krona to bolster the Ukrainian defense, and they're determined that Ukraine will not lose. I think the strategy, if I could just jump to, you know, what's the end game? The end game is some sort of fancy word, strategic neutralization. It basically, in layman's language, is the steel porcupine. Make Ukraine so unpalatable for the Russians they can never swallow it. And that may involve freezing the war at the current front lines and starting a third, fourth war against Ukraine to be so unpalatable that the Russians won't try to do it. And then when Putin passes from the scene, whenever that is, tonight or 10 years from now, we'll see what happens. But the idea is the steel porcupine is the outcome for now.
Well, that's the first I've heard of steel porcupine. That's a good phrase.
Not very tasty.
No. What's in it for Putin if he a steel porcupine? All of his war aims, well, he'll have to backtrack or pretend he didn't have these other war aims of.
Yeah, well, I think it was Monty Python who said, it's fun to be king. And, he controls all the media, all the TV, now, as I mentioned, the internet, what's left of the print press, all the radio. So if he is given no NATO, freeze the lines in place, he can bill this as a victory and then not
Sanctions
let the
lifted.
Russians know about the million men killed and wounded over the last 3.5 years. Because he's censoring everything left and right. Now, it's easier said than done because he's got the country on a war economy. There are a lot of people who are getting big benefits. Factory workers paying extra, getting paid extra. There's survivor benefits, widow benefits. There's a lot of money that's been promised, and that's going to be a toughie to comply with that. And there is a thought, I mean, if we go back to our own history, we tend to romanticize, Butch Cassidy and the great outlaws of the American West in the 1860s and 70s. A lot of them were former soldiers who were looking for something to do and knew how to handle guns. And this happened in Russia when the Afghansi, the Soviet soldiers, came back from Afghanistan and use their guns to distribute the wealth a little bit. And the fear is you take these PSTD guys coming back, it will be very destabilizing for Russia.
How would you rate or how would you assess the U.S. on again, off again provision of weapons to Ukraine over the last 6 months, 8 months, and what the impact has been uh, in Ukraine?
Well, John, as you know, until January 22, I had jet black hair. So it's been 6 years and 6 months. We've seen a lot of flip-flops and backs and forth and really totally unexpected things. It's not been good for Ukraine. It's not been good for Europe, which in turn is not good for us. A lot of our credibility has been pissed away, to be blunt. And, NATO worked on this Article 5, the Three Musketeers thing, all for all for one, and one for all. And that came into doubt. And we had 80 years of relationship, 75 years of relationship and trust that have been built up by hundreds and thousands of American men and women, diplomats, soldiers, posted in Europe, and basically assuring the the Europeans that we care and will be there. And that was thrown into doubt. So Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall. I'm not sure we can put that back together again, at least in the way it was before. The good side is that because of Trump's browbeating, the Europeans finally, and Eisenhower wanted this to happen 60 years ago, 70 years ago, the Europeans are finally starting to pay for their own defense. They're still kind of wishy-washy. Polls show that only 40% of Germans would fight to defend their country. That's great. Hope the Russians didn't see that one.
Mm.
So,
But it does seem to have coalesced Europe and gotten Europe's attention. in a way and strengthened NATO in some respects.
Oh yeah, no, it has. I mean, basically, they all signed up one way or the other to by 2030 to be putting 5% of GDP into defense. Now, of course, the Spaniards didn't want to do it because they're too far away, but and there's some fiddling with the numbers. It's 3.5, and then the 1.5 is like infrastructure, so like reinforcing a highway bridge so a tank can go over it. That's considered defense spending. Cyber security is considered defense spending. But I think they get it, and they're not just getting it because Trump is being mean to them. They're getting it because they see the Russian threat as real. And that's the Nordics, the Baltics, and the Eastern Europeans. And this new chancellor of Germany gets it 110%. I mean, it's no question about it. And Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister of Italy, who everyone thought was sort of a Putin lover, and Macron. So you really have, and Starmer, the prime minister of the UK, you really have the heavyweights. And I've just been through it. Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and that's the big five.
In previous talks, you mentioned the number of Russians leaving Russia, the
Yeah.
men leaving. Any sense of is that still going on? And any idea? We had one question here. Are Russians using this new proposed citizenship by investment in the United States? You pay $5 million, you can become a citizen.
Yeah, I don't know if they are. I'm not aware of that, but I think rule of thumb, the war prompted about 1 million Russians to leave. And frankly, these were about 1 million of the smartest. And their IT sector was hit terribly by this departure. And mostly men, but a lot of women too left. And I don't think they're coming back. I was talking to a Jewish friend over dinner last night, and I said, I guess, and she'd been there in Moscow during the Free Soviet Jewish period of, the 1970s and 80s. And I said, guess how many Jews are left in Russia? And it's like 50,000. I mean, it's extraordinary the number of people that have left to the U.S., to Israel, to sort of transit countries, wherever they could go. I mean, Armenia, Georgia, and I mean, the joke was that when Putin announced the national mobilization, which basically was a national universal draft, and that was 3 years ago, before he stopped talking, every seat on flights out of Moscow to Istanbul were booked. They just all decamped. And once again, these are the well-educated, the smart ones, and it's a real brain drain for Russia.
We had a couple of questions too about other countries. For example, are there North Korean soldiers still fighting in the war? Where does Russia stand with its old allies of Iran and Syria? How has this impacted their non-Ukraine diplomacy?
Well, yes, there are North Koreans. We don't know how many are there now. They didn't do terribly well the first time around. The feeling is more may be coming. I read that there are actually Laotians who are demining in Kursk, which is a welcome activity. The Iranians, of course, sold their Shahed drone technology to the Russians. Once again, this has really defined the limits of Kremlin power, where in January, the president of Iran flew to Moscow, and there's a big signing ceremony of a 20-year strategic partnership between Iran and Russia. 6 months later, Trump bombs the Iranian nuclear power facilities, and all Russia did was protest. They didn't lift a finger. And frankly, that may have also put a little bit the fear of God into Putin, that, Trump does do things like this. And there's this famous thing where I don't know how it came out, but he asked Zelensky, "Can you hit Moscow?" Um, Now, the White House spokeswoman says he just asked that question. He didn't tell him to do that. He didn't give him the green light. But a couple of weeks later, the St. Petersburg airport the Moscow airport was shut down. Then the St. Petersburg airport was shut down, and St. Petersburg. It was very interesting because Navy Day was about 2 weeks ago, and in advance they'd reduced it to Putin reviewing a platoon of Navy cadets and then going into the Navy headquarters and watching things on screens on TV. There was no traditional flotilla down the Neva River through the center of Petersburg. And the Kremlin press pool got there 2 hours late because drone activity had shut the airport. So, people are aware that things are happening.
You touched on a little of Russia and the Caucasus, and with their sphere of influence with Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. Are they so preoccupied with Ukraine that they're allowing these three countries to uh, basically move their own separate way without the Russian heavy influence?
Well, I did hear that they put more Russian soldiers into Gumri, which is the Russian base in northern Armenia, which I visited from the outside. Um, but let's look at Azerbaijan. A Azerbaijan Azer Air flight about a year ago was flying north and literally was shot down over Russia. And the Russians denied it. And the plane was able to get across the Caspian and crash land in Kazakhstan. And, only 37 people were killed. But Russia's denied it. And the Azeris are really pissed off, starting with the president. And then there was some incident about a month ago where in a provincial city in Russia, the police beat to death two Azeri brothers, sort of charging it they were responsible for some gangland murders of 3 years earlier. And the Azeris just went ballistic, and they they kicked out the Sputnik news office from Baku, saying they really were spies, they weren't journalists. And then they arrested about 8 Russians and frog marched them, and beat them. They're actually photographed bleeding and bruised before the cameras, and they were all ethnic Russians and they were Russian citizens. That's not the kind of thing that a formal colony does to a former imperial power that is feeling its oats. Armenia, of course, they let the Armenians down with the Nagorno-Karabakh war of 2 or 3 years ago, and didn't lift a finger, even though they had a self-defense pact. Actually, it was 5 years ago, 4 years ago. So Armenia is very sour on the Russians, and they're saying we're leaving the CSTO, which is sort of like a Warsaw Pact of current era. And they've actually, and this is really traumatic for Armenians because they suffered the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks. But the president of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, went to Ankara and met with Erdogan in a state visit, and then later went to the Emirates and met with the leader of Azerbaijan. And these two leaders, watch the space, may be in Washington in 48 hours signing a peace treaty, which would open up Armenia to trade with Turkey. And the Iranians are screaming bloody murder because they're afraid they won't drive their trucks up north through Armenia. For the US, it's sort of a geopolitical thing where we could put our guys on the northern end of Iran. So things are moving.
Mm. And Russia still controls part of Georgia, right?
Yeah, it controls, I think, about 20%, two areas. The area directly south from Sochi, which is called Abkhazia, which is a beautiful place, but run by some very strange people. I've been there. And and South Ossetia, where I've also been, which is ethnically not Georgian. And the Georgians, it's funny, ethnic groups that are minorities, when they're the majority, then they be kind of crappy to their neighbors. And so the secessions want to have nothing to do with the Georgians. Um, but speaking of Sochi, I had this story. I mean, it's kind of another day, another airfield. Um, Ukrainian drones flew, I guess, all the way over the Black Sea and hit the jet fuel tanks at Sochi airport, which happens to be the fifth largest, busiest airport in Russia. It's a big resort area. I've been there like 5 times. And, so obviously all planes grounded. So these sort of 20-year-old airhead TikTok influencers who had nothing better to do than to sort of film in front of these burning tanks. And they filmed a what's called a hookah rap, which is as in smoking hookah. And the song is called Crimson Dawn. And so behind these two cuties are these burning. And so, of course, they were arrested. The thing went viral. But for me, it was sort of an illustration of how Russians are kind of taking in their stride that their president cannot protect them and that drones will hit and their plans will have to change. And, that's the price of living in Russia.
Mhm. Any update? We have a question on the Ukrainian children who were kidnapped and taken into Russia.
Uh, some are dribbling back. Um, that goes back to my first D of demographics, that the Russians are not reproducing very well, neither the Ukrainians. So the Slavic population in Russia is decreasing. So they saw, let's improve the gene pool by importing tens of thousands, maybe 20,000 Ukrainian kids. Um, at the beginning of my career, I covered the dirty war in Argentina, where the children of leftists would be sort of adopted by military intelligence couples. And, you know, that 50 years later is still an issue in Argentina. There's something called genetics, and people can tell who's dad and who isn't dad. And when I was in Argentina, there were the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the May Square, and they would demonstrate, and it has not gone away of trying to reunite people. So I think the Russian government doesn't really care what happens in Argentina, but this is not a quick fix to your demographic problems.
Does Ukraine also have demographic issues?
Oh yeah, they're just not. Well, one huge problem is that there are probably 5 million, largely women, who are refugees in Eastern Europe and Germany. Um, Ideally, they'll come back. They're often with their children. Um, but if you've been with your son in a German kindergarten for 3 or 4 years, you may not want to come back to Russia, to Ukraine. So the Germans are actually starting to cut them off for saying, if you want, you got to work. You can't just sit here on the. There's a wonderful word in German, Bürgergeld, which is the Geld being money and the Bürger meaning town money. You can't just live off town money. Um,
Do you think that looking ahead at a possible breakthrough or these discussions that the Ukrainians would accept the steel porcupine, as you called it,
yeah,
with loss of territory?
I think no Ukrainian politician, starting with the President Zelensky, could formally accept a Russian occupation of Ukrainian land, which is the four regions and Crimea. There are formulas, and you're a diplomat. I mean, they either can agree to disagree or something. I mean, South Korea does not recognize North Korea, does not recognize the North Korean sovereignty over north of DMZ. So I think you'd have that kind of situation. I think for decades, West Germany did not recognize East Germany's occupation of the eastern third of the country. Um, So, but just the way I think polls indicate that most Russians, I've seen like 70% would like the fighting to stop. I think there's a similar percentage in Ukraine. Um, but at one point, Putin was saying, well, we want the delineated areas, these four regions we've annexed, but they don't control part of it, and the rate they're going, it'll take another 5 years before they even win control of these four areas. So that's a non-starter for Ukrainians to surrender land that they do not control.
And then how does Ukraine rebuild?
Well, they're a known brand. Everyone knows where it is. They stopped talking about Kiev, they talk about Kyiv. Stop talking about the Ukraine, they talk about Ukraine. Um, it's interesting, Blackstone had a Rebuild Ukraine fund that when it was clear that Trump was going to be president, they just kind of quietly turned the spigot off on that. I think if there is a sort of North Korea, South Korea believable armistice and defendable line, rebuild money will come in from Europe and from the US. I know several people who are sort of working on that, potential funds. I mean, the great thing about Ukraine, or in addition to the grains, but also the brains, I mean, 80% of Ukrainian adults have had higher education. They're very smart people, generally, if you can stereotype them. And if the Europeans come in, sort of EU colonialism, firing half the judges and building a real system of law, um, I think there will be a lot of investment. But if there's some sort of loosey-goosey, phony ceasefire that isn't a really ironclad armistice that's backed up by NATO or NATO troops, investors will size that up, and will they invest? I mean, let's go back to, would you put your money in Russia, where the president says only coward pays their debts, and where 1,000 companies have been nationalized? Um, Not a great investment environment.
No, and especially when there was supposedly a, a diplomatic breakthrough in 2014 that Russia would respect the borders of Ukraine, and 8 years later,
Yeah.
uh, they
Oh,
changed it.
when I was living there, the war was going on, and that's why when I write, I say something about the full bore attack or the full scale attack, because there was definitely, I went down to the front line or near it, and I saw, you know, uh, howitzers moving through fields and boom, boom, boom. I mean, they were fighting a low key war um, up until the big one.
Hmm. So you're a journalist and you have your own network. We have one question that says, why isn't the war reported more in the United States? How would you assess the coverage of Russia, Ukraine in the United States
Well,
mainstream journal?
things come up. I once had a foreign editor at the New York Times, Bernie Gortzman, who said, readers can't have two big foreign stories in their mind at the same time, and it's like, oh, well, there's this, then there's this, this. Um, and so things come up, like notably Gaza, that knock Ukraine off the front page. Um, I'm not sure what sort of impact it has, because I think there is the support for Ukraine, polls show, is still pretty high. We hear a lot from kind of the Tucker Carlson fringe, who are sort of not interested, but I'm sorry, there were American firsters in the 1930s. There were people who did not want to get into war against Nazi Germany. Um, I'm not saying we should get into war with Russia, but I'm just saying that um, we haven't always been so internationalist. And I think it's for me it's interesting the Trump turnaround where he was very kind of loosey-goosey with Putin, and we just went, what is going on here? Why is he doing this? Is still trying to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. What's the motivation here? But then he turned, and it may have been that Melania, who's from Slovenia, told him, the Russians are not trustworthy. And but he turned and turned hard, and I can cite story after story. I mean, just last week, Reuters is a very reputable, solid, well-reported outfit, and they wrote a story saying that basically that oil analysts say, and they're of course calling on the best of the best, that Trump will not impose sanctions on India, and Reuters has a very strong presence in India because former British colony, blah blah blah. And they got it completely wrong. I mean, Trump did it, and now he's saying he might impose these sanctions on China for buying Russian oil. And I, I'm a skeptic, but let's see what happens. So Trump says the right thing. He says very loudly and very clearly the killing has to stop. That this is ridiculous that two countries that are basically kissing cousins before the war should be killing each other. And he says it and he keeps saying it. It's not just an offhand comment. And I think he wants the war to stop. Now, does he want to get the Nobel Peace Prize? Yes, he does. Well, if that turns him on, great. If that incentivates him, great.
Good. Well, I think that about covers it all, and that's we're hopeful. We're going to be looking at the next week and weeks after, seeing if there is any common ground that can be found between Ukraine and Russia, and what that would look like.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that there are only two people in the world that can stop the war. And one is Donald Trump, and the other is Putin, Vladimir Putin. I mean, Zelensky would like to stop the war, but it's not in his power. I mean, Putin stopped the war, invaded a neighboring country, and he's got, I don't know, 500,000 troops on the soil of a neighboring country. So it's really the only two people in the world that can stop the war. And China shows no interest in stopping the war. In fact, they have told, their foreign minister told the foreign minister of the European Union something to the effect that Russia cannot lose this war. We cannot allow Russia to lose the war. So China is not going to lift a finger for peace in this case.
And so I'm going to just probe a little on that. That only two people, that Trump is one of them. Is it because of, certainly not just the rhetoric? I read something this week said, "Oh, Trump has soured on Putin, but Putin doesn't care."
Yeah, he doesn't, but I think, well, I think Putin would like to retain his relationship with Trump. I think he values that. I think Putin, I cited these cases where Putin may be approaching back against the wall time, the economy, the demographics, the fact that he really isn't winning the war, despite what he'd like everyone to believe. And so, he may see this as sort of an escape hatch. Putin doesn't do nice, or he doesn't do things according to personal relationships. He does what's good for him.
Right. Well, and he's probably remembering what happened to the regime in Russia after in the Soviet Union after they pulled out of Afghanistan too. He's a student of history.
Yeah.
He's got to manage this to protect himself. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, he's used this phrase several times that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. Well, what about World War II? But I mean, that's his view of the world.
Right, right. Well, this has been very enlightening as always, Jim. I'm hoping that the next one that we do in November-ish, the time frame in the fall, we have a very changed scenario, and that everybody wishes that and hopes for that. It's really just a terrible war.
Well, thank you, John, and it's a pleasure to talk to everybody. And I do look forward to it. And by the way, I'll get better lighting next time.
No, it looks fine. And really very much appreciate all your insights and your background knowledge. And that's why we keep coming back and wanting to do this, because we hear stuff from you that we don't hear anywhere else. It's
Yeah, well,
really
read my
important.
articles on the New York Sun.
Yep, will
Great.
do.
Okay,
Okay.
John. Good night. Goodbye,
Good night.
Judith.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yep,
Have a good
bye.
night, everyone.